Greetings, my dear friends. Today, we delve into one of history's most audacious and captivating mysteries. What if everything we know about the past is merely a carefully edited version, concealing an incredible truth that could completely overturn our understanding of the world? Imagine for a moment that the history, passed down by word of mouth and solidified into dogma for nearly 2 millennia, is just an incomplete fragment of a much larger, more intricate mosaic. What if, beneath centuries of official doctrines, behind a veil of reverent silence, lies a forbidden truth so radical and astonishing that its revelation could not only shake the foundations of faith, but utterly shatter them, topple mighty thrones, and challenge the Church's most unwavering authority? The question we dare to ask today is simple in its phrasing, yet it echoes like thunder through the quiet, dusty chambers of history, making us wonder, what if Jesus of Nazareth, a figure whose life and teachings shaped entire civilizations, left behind not only teachings, but also direct descendants, daughters? This thought, though sacrilegious to many, opens the door to an entirely different dimension of understanding the gospel events and their consequences. We won't just listen. We will strain to hear the faint whispers that history itself seemingly tried to methodically silence, and we will gather the scattered fragments that were never meant to be forgotten. We are not talking about symbolic images or allegorical interpretations, but about living flesh and blood, daughters born into a world utterly unprepared to acknowledge their existence, let alone their significance. These presumed heiresses would carry in their veins a unique blend, both the dust of ordinary humanity and, perhaps, the breath of divinity, making them living embodiments of an unprecedented legacy. Their appearance on the historical stage, if recognized, would alter the entire paradigm of religious and social order, offering a completely new interpretation of sacred texts and prophecies. Allow yourself for a moment to consider what such a stunning truth might mean for the faith we profess today. The faith we know and accept was shaped not only by what was carefully preserved and passed down through generations, but also, perhaps significantly, by what was purposefully erased from the annals. In the long, majestic corridors of cathedrals and at closed synods, where the fates of doctrines were decided and canons defined, the history of Christ was not merely recorded. It was narrowed, trimmed, and meticulously carved until it acquired the form we unconditionally recognize today. Every inconvenient fragment, every slightest mention of family ties, potential descendants, or human aspects of his life that could undermine the dogma of his exclusive divinity, was quietly yet relentlessly buried beneath ever-growing layers of theological dogmas and ecclesiastical decrees. However, despite all efforts, this whisper of history persists. It seeps through the tiniest cracks in forbidden texts, through little-known pages of apocryphal gospels that were rejected as heretical, and even through hidden symbols artfully woven into works of art and ancient legends. These are not just rumors. They are a persistent voice, narrating a bloodline that belongs not only to kings or prophets, but also to daughters, hidden children whose very existence would threaten to upset the established balance of power, based on male priesthood and singular authority. These hints, though fragmented, point to the existence of a parallel history where the feminine principle would play a key role in the inheritance of spiritual and perhaps even worldly influence. If this topic makes you think and stirs your imagination, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It's incredibly important for its promotion and allows us to continue exploring history's deepest mysteries. Also, write in the comments where you are watching this video from, so we know how far our search for truth extends. A natural question arises: why would daughters, rather than sons, represent such a threat and be the object of such careful concealment? In the ancient world, which was deeply patriarchal, a daughter, at first glance, seemed simultaneously invisible and, paradoxically, an unstoppable force. Her name could be easily erased from official records. Her face would be absent from chronicles dedicated to great men. However, it was through her womb, through her ability to bear children, that the line could continue without interruption. She became a hidden thread, silently but relentlessly weaving into the fabric of history, ensuring a secret legacy that was virtually impossible to destroy, even when her name was struck from the pages of collective memory. In this context, a woman was not just a continuer of the lineage, but also a keeper of sacred mystery, passed down from generation to generation. This is why, some researchers believe, the early Christian church so deeply feared the very idea of Jesus' descendants, especially daughters. To acknowledge that Jesus had daughters would mean acknowledging that his divine authority and sacred legacy were not limited exclusively to the Holy Scriptures or to the sacraments performed by priests. It would mean that his essence lived in the flesh, walked among ordinary people, was passed down in the veins of women, who by their nature were much harder to control than a hierarchy of male clergy. And so, if these daughters truly existed, they had to be erased from history. Erased not only through physical violence or persecution, but, much more effectively, through silence. The most effective form of oblivion is not the destruction of evidence, but its omission, its disregard. Remove their names, omit their stories from official narratives, sow doubt in the very possibility of their existence, and soon the world will forget they ever were. But human memory, like history itself, is never completely lost. Here and there, even centuries later, a faint, almost imperceptible trace remains. It might be an image secretly carved into the stone of an ancient temple, or a story whispered among heretics and hidden communities, passed down through generations. It might be a symbol artfully depicted in the folds of a Madonna's robe on an old icon, or a subtle hint in forgotten manuscripts. Each such clue is fragile, each fragment disputed and questioned by modern historians and theologians. But together, they begin to form the outline of a story that, despite all attempts, refuses to disappear from collective consciousness. These bits of information, like shards of an ancient mosaic, gradually assemble into a picture that may prove to be far more complete and unexpected than we are accustomed to believing. And then the boldest hypothesis arises. Could it be that the true Holy Grail, this mystical artifact sought by knights and adventurers for centuries, was never a golden chalice, but something far more alive and precious, the bloodline of Jesus' daughters? Could it be that even now, in our modern reality, somewhere in the forgotten genealogies of ancient European families, in the blood of ancient dynasties whose roots go deep into millennia, or in the lives of those who never even suspected the great weight of their heritage, Christ's daughters continue to live? No one can claim this with absolute certainty, but tonight, let us allow ourselves to follow this intriguing whisper. Let us journey into the shadowed places where memory and myth are intricately intertwined, where history bends into mystery, and where the most important question still awaits its answer under the silent veil of centuries? What if the greatest secret was not so much that Christ lived, but that his daughters survived and continued his legacy? This topic only lifts the veil on the mystery, and we strongly urge you to watch this video to the very end, as the most important conclusions, which may change your perception of the past, will be made in the final part. And you can always find new videos on this and other fascinating topics via the link in the description. If we assume that Christ indeed left behind a family, a natural and unsettling question arises: where could they have disappeared? History, as is known, is written by the victors and those who remain in power, and power, by its nature, often prefers to consign to oblivion that which does not serve its interests or undermines its authority. A lineage directly descended from Jesus, especially one passed through daughters, would represent an existential threat to the early Christian church. Its power and monopoly on truth were based on the idea that salvation and access to the divine could only come through a strictly defined hierarchy: priests, bishops, and ultimately popes. Any alternative link, especially a living, blood-related one, would disrupt this carefully constructed system. But a bloodline, a living legacy, was precisely what they could not control. A living heir, a bearer of this sacred blood, would not need permission or blessing from Rome to claim power and spiritual authority. Their mere existence would challenge the Church's monopoly on interpreting divine will and distributing grace. Imagine a woman, a daughter of Christ, standing in a bustling town square, her very existence a living refutation of the entire power structure built in the name of her supposed father. Her blood would become her gospel, her body a vessel of an unbreakable covenant, requiring no intermediaries. And so the agonizing question arises again: if they truly existed, what happened to these women, these potential living relics? Some ancient traditions whisper of exile, of a secret evacuation. The family, perhaps, was secretly moved from the tumultuous Holy Land, transported across seas by loyal followers who well understood that Jerusalem and its environs were no longer a safe haven. Perhaps they disappeared into the obscurity of distant lands, where their names were changed, their history silenced, and their true origins carefully concealed until the world no longer remembered who they truly were. This was not just an escape, but a strategic retreat aimed at preserving the lineage. But even in total oblivion, memory is never a complete loss. Just as a receding tide leaves behind fragments of shells and sea glass on the sand, history leaves behind subtle but persistent fragments of truth, awaiting discovery. It is in the apocryphal Gospels, those texts declared heretical and hidden away from the eyes of the faithful, that one can sometimes find subtle hints of a continuing bloodline, quietly flowing through unnamed figures. These lines are like faint tracks on ancient soil, erased again and again, but still discernible to those with a keen eye and the ability to read between the lines. And in the medieval world, centuries later, this idea re-emerged in whispers and encrypted messages. The Grail legends, so popular during that period, speak not only of mystical chalices, but also of bloodlines, of sang real, which in French means royal blood, but can also be read as holy blood. Some scholars, investigating these myths, believe that it was never a search for a physical object, but rather a search for a family, a line of descendants so carefully hidden that only symbols and allegories could reveal its existence to the initiated. Why then should it have disappeared so irrevocably? The fact is that in the ancient Mediterranean, lineage was of paramount importance. Monarchs asserted their power by right of birth, spiritual leaders traced their origins to prophets, and entire dynasties flourished or declined based on the might of their blood. To acknowledge that Jesus might have left daughters would mean that his divine legacy did not end on the cross. It would continue in living blood, in flesh, in the hidden veins of future generations. For the ecclesiastical hierarchy, such a thought was utterly inconceivable. Their claims were based on the premise that they were the sole, infallible repository of divine authority. However, the existence of a living bloodline would bypass all these institutions. No cleric, no bishop, no pope could ever match the authority of one who carried the same blood as Christ himself. This is why this story was erased from the annals. Church councils resolutely rejected any texts that even hinted at Christ's human nature, his family, or possible heirs. These writings were declared heresy, their creators persecuted and silenced, and the communities that followed them were ruthlessly destroyed. Daughters, if they existed, dissolved into the silent shadow of time. And yet, even the deepest shadows leave faint outlines. What if their descendants became the unacknowledged wives of kings? The quiet mothers of noble dynasties, whose names were never recorded in official chronicles? And what if their true names were preserved not as daughters of Christ, but as forgotten figures buried in countless European genealogies? Their secret was passed down from generation to generation in deep silence. The disappearance of a bloodline is not irrefutable proof of its absence. On the contrary, it may be the most compelling evidence of all. For what force could be more powerful than a truth so dangerous that it had to be completely erased from collective memory? And so we are left with a faint whisper. Perhaps Christ's bloodline was never destroyed. Perhaps it was simply artfully concealed, awaiting the moment when the world would rediscover what was once most strictly forbidden. If there is one figure in the New Testament who, like a shadow, lingers on the very edge of mystery, it is undoubtedly Mary Magdalene. For some, she appeared as a repentant sinner, a woman saved from darkness by Christ's grace. For others, she was the apostle to the apostles, entrusted with the first revelation of the resurrection itself. But beneath these contradictory images lies another role, whispered in heretical texts, hinted at in ancient legends, and perhaps too dangerous for the Church to allow it to exist: the role of wife, mother, and guardian of a sacred bloodline. The canonical Gospels offer us extremely meager information. They reduce Magdalene to a mere follower, a witness, a background figure whose significance briefly flares at the tomb before dissolving back into oblivion. However, the Gospels that were rejected, the so-called apocrypha, speak with an entirely different voice. In the Gospel of Philip, a text buried for centuries until its rediscovery at Nag Hammadi, Magdalene is described not merely as a disciple, but as one whom Christ loved more than all others, whom he often kissed. It is said that the other apostles were envious of her exceptional closeness to the teacher. Some scholars tend to dismiss this as a mere metaphor, indicating spiritual intimacy. But others ask a question the Church never wished to utter aloud: was it something more? If Christ and Magdalene were bound by a sacred union, then she could be not just a witness to his life, but a vessel of his continuation. A mother carrying the future of his lineage in her womb. This single possibility radically changes all conventional perceptions. For centuries, Magdalene was depicted either as a sinner or a saint, but rarely as an equal partner. The role of wife would have made her a central figure in the entire story, the very axis around which his legacy could revolve. And if she had borne his children, if she had brought forth his daughters, then her erasure from history was not merely an act of misogyny. It was a strategic necessity. Imagine how different the world would look if her story had been preserved. Imagine a Christianity that honored not only the divine masculine, but also the divine feminine, embodied in the union of Christ and Magdalene, passed through daughters who represented both the continuation of his blood and the sacred authority of womanhood. But history chose an entirely different path. Instead, Magdalene was reinterpreted as a repentant prostitute, a figure of shame, not power. This image, though never mentioned in the Bible itself, was actively preached by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century and became firmly entrenched in Christian tradition. With a single sermon, her potential role as partner and mother was buried under centuries of dishonor and stigma. And yet, she never completely disappeared. In the south of France, legends still persist of a woman who arrived by boat, carrying whispers of holiness. She is said to have lived in the caves of Provence, weeping and praying until her death. But some versions of this story add an important detail that the Church omitted. She did not come alone. She came with a child, a daughter, perhaps even more than one. If this is true, then Mary Magdalene's role was not merely to witness the resurrection. It was to carry the very life of Christ, hidden in the veins of her children. The Church may have buried her story, but in the hills of France, in the symbols of the Black Madonna, and in the coded legends of the Grail, the secret survived. Was she a sinner, a saint, or the mother of a hidden bloodline? Perhaps she was all three, woven into a story too dangerous to survive the historian's pen, but too powerful to be forgotten. If Magdalene's role was so significant, the question naturally arises, why do official historical chronicles remain silent about it? Perhaps the answer lies not in what was recorded, but in what was deliberately left outside written testimonies. The early Christian Church did not act as an impartial guardian of the past. It was a nascent structure, actively engaged in asserting its authority, developing doctrines, and determining whose name would be preserved for centuries and who would be consigned to oblivion. In this process, silence proved to be its most effective tool. In the first centuries after Christ's departure, Christian communities were diverse, fragmented, and often in a state of internal disagreement. Some adherents firmly stood on the position of a purely spiritual Christ, seeing him as a divine being untouched by earthly needs of the flesh. Others, on the contrary, emphasized his human essence, his blood ties, and family connections. Amidst these competing views, the idea of Christ as a husband and father was by no means inconceivable. It was one of many stories freely circulating in the cultural space of the ancient Mediterranean. However, as the Church began to consolidate its power, such narratives came to be perceived as a threat to its centralized control. At church councils, for example, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where bishops gathered by imperial decree to determine the future of Christianity, unity and uniformity were valued significantly higher than authenticity. Texts that diverged from the chosen official narrative were condemned. Writings that detailed Magdalene too much, that too openly hinted at hidden heirs, were declared heretical and ruthlessly discarded. By suppressing the very possibility of Christ having a family, the Church secured something fundamental: exclusivity. Power could not be concentrated in the hands of invisible and uncontrollable descendants. It had to flow through bishops, popes, and priests, exclusively men who were established as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Nevertheless, this enforced silence was not absolute. Here and there, faint echoes persisted. The Gospel of Mary, a text discovered in a papyrus codex, presents Magdalene as a teacher of hidden wisdom, one who comforts the disciples after the crucifixion. She speaks with undeniable authority. But the Apostle Peter disputes her role, insisting that Christ could not have revealed such truths to a woman. The text breaks off mid-sentence, leaving us to wonder what else was omitted or deliberately removed. What else could have been said about her true role? This interruption was no accident. It was part of a deliberate strategy. To completely erase such a threatening truth, it was not enough to simply deny its existence. A replacement had to be offered, and this is why Magdalene's image was reinterpreted. She ceased to be a teacher of secret wisdom, no longer a possible companion of Christ. Instead, she appeared as a repentant sinner. Her name was forever linked with shame and redemption. The Church's silence was deafening. And yet, the more fiercely this silencing was enforced, the stronger grew the curiosity about the emerging gaps. Why go to such lengths to erase? Why such insistence on promoting only one version of her story? Is it possible that this very silence serves as proof that the truth is not merely forgotten, but purposefully hidden? Within monastic walls, whispers might have been preserved. In remote villages, legends might have been passed down by word of mouth around a campfire, and in symbols carved in stone, depicted in frescoes, and secretly transmitted through closed societies, the possibility of Christ's daughters continued to live, awaiting the day when Rome's silence would be broken. For silence is never eternal. It can conceal, suppress, bury, but it cannot destroy. Somewhere beneath the ashes of forgotten texts and the weight of dogmatic assertions, the story of Christ's hidden bloodline still persists. If Rome attempted to silence this story, where then can we find its faintest echoes? They appear in the apocrypha, in those Gospels that were rejected, called heretical, and hidden from public view. These are voices that manage to seep through the cracks of orthodoxy, fragile yet persistent, whispering of possibilities that the official church dared not canonize. The Gospel of Mary is one such text. In it, Magdalene is depicted not merely as a follower, but as one who comforts and instructs other disciples. Peter resists her authority, asking, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly with us?" Her role here is that of a leader, an intimate, a closeness that hints at something more than just a teacher-student relationship. The Gospel of Philip goes even further. It describes Magdalene as Christ's companion, loved above all others. The text mentions that he often kissed her and describes the envy of the apostles who wondered why she received such favor. Was this a purely spiritual manifestation? Perhaps. But then why the envy? Why such insistence that she received revelations unavailable to others? These texts do not directly mention daughters, but in the gaps, omissions, and metaphors, some researchers detect the subtlest hint of a family. If Magdalene was a companion, If she was loved above all others, then it is not impossible that she could also have been a mother. The word companion in the original language carries meanings of closeness, partnership, and even marital connection. Other apocryphal works, the Acts of Philip, the Gospel of the Hebrews, Pistis Sophia, present their ideas in allegories and fragments, invariably elevating Magdalene and always hinting at a degree of intimacy that could not be completely erased from collective memory. However, the most striking echo comes not from what these texts directly state, but from what they choose to omit. Why do these writings so fiercely insist on preserving Magdalene's authority? Why do they present her as one entrusted with secrets that other disciples could not comprehend? Is it possible that they are merely shadows of a much greater truth, and that she carried not only teachings, but also children? The apocrypha became dangerous precisely because they left this possibility open. They preserved the memory of Magdalene as a central, intimate, authoritative figure. And if we acknowledge that she was Christ's companion, loved above all others, then the next question naturally follows. Did they have a family? The early church could not agree with such a question. That is why apocryphal texts were consigned to oblivion. Their manuscripts were carefully hidden in the depths of desert caves, their lines ruthlessly burned in crowded city squares, and communities that dared to cherish this knowledge were declared heretical and annihilated in the fires of cruel persecutions. However, absolute silence is impossible. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in 1945, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls in subsequent years, reopened doors that had once been tightly shut. Suddenly, the old whispers returned, like echoes from the depths of centuries. Hidden voices once again spoke of Magdalene's exceptional role, her undeniable closeness to the teacher, her authority, and behind all these revelations always remained an unspoken but palpable question. Did she leave behind more than just teachings? Did she have daughters? The Apocrypha, of course, do not give a direct answer, but in their scattered fragments, in their torn lines and missing pages, they leave enough room for silent contemplation, enough space for the imagination to fill it with possibilities that the official church dared not preserve. Perhaps the very absence of certain testimonies is the most eloquent echo. Perhaps the greatest proof is not what was written and has come down to us, but precisely what was deliberately erased from history. If Mary Magdalene truly carried Christ's bloodline to France, where could she have gone? The Holy Land, torn by continuous conflicts and subject to persecution, would never have been a safe haven for a woman and her children. This is why ancient legends tell of her flight, a sea journey away from Jerusalem to the harsh but hospitable shores of southern Gaul. This story is still mysteriously whispered in Provence, where many villages today bear traces of her name. In the town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, tradition tells of a small boat without sails or oars, carrying Mary Magdalene, her companions, and in some versions, a child. Washed ashore by the waves, they reached the salt marshes of France, a place that was both desolate and sacred, an ideal refuge where exiles could disappear into obscurity. Here, her presence is felt in the stone and in the very history of the region. The grotto of Saint-Baume, high in the mountains, is believed to be where she spent her last years. Pilgrims today still ascend its rocky path, whispering prayers in the silence where she is said to have prayed and wept. But what was she weeping about? repentance, as the Church teaches, or the burden of a great secret too dangerous to reveal. Local tradition persistently claims she was not alone. She was accompanied by sisters, faithful companions, and perhaps someone else. Some sources claim she carried a daughter, her child by Christ, whose descendants would later intermarry with noble families of southern France, their bloodline hidden in plain sight among the lords and ladies of the region. In this landscape, memory is artfully woven into symbols. Thus, the Black Madonnas of Provence, statues of dark-skinned mothers with infants, have been linked by some researchers precisely to Magdalene. Their hidden message is a reminder of a mother who carried sacred blood into exile. Why France? Perhaps because Gaul was far beyond Rome's direct reach, a frontier territory where exiles could live without constant surveillance. Perhaps because allies awaited them there, communities sympathetic to her presence, her message, her lineage. Or perhaps because this land on the edge of the empire was destined to become the cradle of a secret dynasty. Legends live and persist precisely because they never completely disappear. Churches dedicated to Magdalene rise throughout Provence, and festivals annually celebrate her arrival by sea. And always, on the fringes of these celebrations, the same question remains. Was she merely a saint who repented in solitude, or a mother who brought with her the daughters of Christ, hidden under the veil of myth? Exile is not just a flight from danger, it is also an act of preservation. By disappearing into the wild hills of France, Magdalene and her children, if they truly existed, ensured that the bloodline would not perish in the violence of the Jerusalem events. It would quietly continue in the valleys of Europe, weaving into the fabric of families who, perhaps, never realized the full weight of what they inherited. And so the whisper continues. Southern France was not just her refuge, it was the cradle of a legacy that the Church could not erase. If Mary Magdalene indeed carried Christ's bloodline into exile, what reminders might she have left behind? In churches and chapels across France, Spain, and Italy stand enigmatic statues known as Black Madonnas, these dark-skinned figures of the Virgin and Child, robed in gold and shadow, gaze with stern yet tender eyes. For centuries, they have been objects of profound veneration, attracting pilgrims who kneel before them, lighting candles at their base. But what if they represent something more than just the Virgin Mary? Some researchers believe these figures conceal an entirely different story. Their darkness, it is argued, is not merely an artistic choice or the result of candle smoke accumulation, but a powerful symbol, a hidden reference to Mary Magdalene and her secret role as the mother of a sacred bloodline. Unlike the pale and delicate Madonnas of the Renaissance, Black Madonnas stand deeply rooted in the earth. Their presence seems primal, almost older than Christianity itself. What if they were created to remind the faithful of a truth the Church so diligently sought to erase? That Christ's legacy continued not only through spirit and sacrament, but also through the womb of a woman who bore his children. In the lands of Provence, where according to ancient traditions, Mary Magdalene ended her earthly journey, these enigmatic statues are found with the greatest frequency. For many centuries, pilgrims have invariably associated them with miraculous phenomena, inexplicable healings, and powerful protection, as if the figures of women, carved in stone or wood, possessed some hidden power passed down through generations. Is there not an echo of the memory of a carefully concealed bloodline behind this supposed power? Moreover, the image of the Black Madonna serves as a vivid embodiment of the sacred feminine, which has long been systematically suppressed within Western cultural and religious tradition. Her silent presence seems to whisper of long past times when the divine was perceived not exclusively as the image of a father, but also as a maternal principle, not only as an authoritative king, but also as a life-giving womb. Her placement at the very heart of Christian worship may have been an unspoken act of quiet disobedience, a unique method of preserving truths that could not be openly spoken. It is noteworthy that an unchanging detail of each such statue is the figure of a child, yet its true identity may not be as unambiguous as commonly believed. For while official church doctrine firmly asserts that every Madonna and child symbolizes the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ, there are other hypotheses that open up a different perspective. Some researchers and adherents of alternative theories allow that in certain cases, this child may represent the daughters of Christ, whose legacy was passed to the world by Mary Magdalene. Thus, these ancient sculptures may encode not one, but two parallel stories. The story of the Virgin who gave the world a Savior, and the story of the companion who gave life to his heirs. A natural question arises: why are these Madonnas depicted in dark tones? Some researchers believe that their unusual color serves as a bridge to significantly older cultural and religious traditions, referring to goddesses of Egypt and the Middle East, whose images were often dark, symbolizing fertility, deep mystery, and the vital force of the earth itself. Others see in this blackness a deliberate veil, an ingenious way of concealing truth in plain sight. Perhaps the depiction of Magdalene in the form of a Black Madonna was a kind of cipher, a sacred symbol, understandable only to a narrow circle of initiates, those who were aware of the legend of her exile and the true meaning of her role. The official church generally tolerates their presence, but this tolerance is often tinged with unconcealed reluctance. For centuries, theologians have fiercely debated their true meaning, often reducing their role to mere curiosities or attempting to rationally explain their origin. And yet, despite doctrinal disagreements, the faithful continue to light candles at their feet, silently whisper prayers, and carry away a deep sense that these enigmatic figures carry something far greater than the confines of official doctrine allow. The Black Madonnas, like silent and vigilant guardians, remain in their places, preserving a secret that stubbornly refuses to disappear. They stand as dark witnesses, etched in stone and wood, perhaps reminding descendants that Christ's daughters were never completely erased from history, but merely artfully concealed in symbols that ecclesiastical authority could not fully control. If we assume that Mary Magdalene indeed carried the sacred bloodline to France, then a logical question arises: who ensured its survival in a foreign land? Exile alone, of course, would not have been enough to preserve such a valuable heritage. A mother and her daughters, even in hiding in caves or under the care of devoted followers, would undoubtedly have needed reliable and constant protection. This is why ancient legends tell of the existence of guardians, powerful local dynasties, influential noble families, and enigmatic secret allies, who adopted this bloodline into their own, thereby subtly weaving the sacred blood into the very fabric of European history and aristocracy. In the rugged and picturesque hills of Occitania, a region where the influential and distinctive Cathar culture once flourished, whispers still circulate about certain families who trace their lineage back to Magdalene's companions, These noble lords and ladies, often in open conflict with the Roman Church, seemed destined by fate itself to protect a great secret capable of undermining the very foundations of ecclesiastical power. Were they not merely rebels who dared to oppose Rome, but true guardians of an invaluable heritage? Such a concept does not seem so far-fetched. In a society where power and status were measured primarily by the strength and purity of bloodlines, the most reliable way to protect Christ's descendants would have been to merge them with existing noble and influential houses. Thus, in carefully drafted marriage contracts and ancient genealogical scrolls, divine blood could be cleverly hidden, yet reliably preserved for future generations. What was initially perceived as exile after a few generations could have transformed into an invisible yet powerful influence. The royal courts of Europe, perhaps, quietly carried this sacred blood of Christ, never uttering its name aloud. This intriguing possibility raises a number of very unsettling questions. Did the monarchs and their consorts of medieval Europe unknowingly inherit a lineage originating in distant Galilee? Were solemn coronations, accompanied by lavish prayers for the divine right to rule, actually rooted in something much older and more mystical? In such a case, it would be a hidden inheritance, granting legitimacy not through papal blessing, but through birth itself. Certain historical traditions and legends point to the Merovingian dynasty, known as the long-haired kings of the Franks, whose rule spanned from the 5th to the 8th century. It was said that they possessed a mystical power, unique healing abilities, and a special aura of divine right that no pope could bestow. Could this exceptional power have come not from folklore legends, but from the blood itself? Perhaps it was blood passed to their lineage from Magdalene and her descendants, her daughters. If such a hypothesis is true, then these guardians were far more than just political figures of their time. They were true keepers of ancient memory, entrusted with a secret too dangerous for widespread dissemination in the world of that era. Their mission was not only to preserve wealth and landholdings, but far more importantly, to safeguard a sacred bloodline whose survival testified that Christ's legacy was not limited to the pages of Holy Scripture. It was living, breathing, continuing through the flesh and bones of his descendants. And who else, besides the aforementioned dynasties, could have played such a significant role in this centuries-old drama? Centuries later, the Knights Templar were often rumored to have discovered not only ancient genealogical records and valuable relics, but even living heirs directly connected to this mysterious bloodline. Their sudden rise to wealth, their unspoken but colossal power, and finally, their catastrophic persecution. All these facts seem to suggest that they might have been guardians of something far more significant than mere gold. Could it have been the sacred bloodline of Christ's daughters, which continued to exist, hidden beneath numerous layers of history? The keeping of such a profound secret inevitably meant living in constant silence. Noble families capable of providing refuge for this sacred line could never afford to openly declare it to the world. Instead, they preserved it, using a sophisticated system of symbols hidden in coats of arms, allegories in works of art, and stories passed down by word of mouth around roaring fires. Each subsequent generation took on this burden, never fully revealing the whole truth, but never allowing it to completely fade. Thus, this mission of guardianship continued, quietly, imperceptibly, buried in carefully orchestrated marriages and political alliances, whispered in secluded monasteries and grand castles. Perhaps the greatest miracle of all lies not so much in the fact that such a bloodline could exist at all, but in the fact that it managed to survive for centuries, remaining hidden in plain sight, carefully guarded by those who deeply understood its true power, and preserved by families who knew that the memory of Christ's daughters was too sacred to ever disappear without a trace. Among the many conjectures about potential descendants of Christ, no name stands out as brightly as that of the Merovingians. They represented the foremost powerful dynasty of the Franks, rulers of the lands of Gaul during the early Middle Ages. Their kings ascended the throne, not blessed by Rome, but by an aura of mystical, almost sacred legitimacy. They were called rois chevelus, meaning long-haired kings, as their flowing locks were considered the deep source of their power, an obvious sign of their divine right to rule. But from where did this profound sense of divinity actually originate? The Church regarded them with clear suspicion and animosity. The Merovingians were not the result of papal blessing or coronation, and were unwilling to fully submit to the dictates of the Roman Curia. Nevertheless, their subjects surrounded their monarchs with sincere devotion that seemed to transcend traditional monarchical worship. Ancient legends claimed that the Merovingians were endowed with the ability to heal with a mere touch, that they were bearers of certain mysterious powers, and that their rule was consecrated not by human decree, but by something unimaginably ancient, sacred, and deeply hidden. And it is here that the intriguing suggestion linking them to Mary Magdalene lies. Some researchers hypothesize that the Merovingians, who ascended the throne in the 5th century, were descendants of a secret genealogical line of Christ himself, brought to the lands of France by Mary Magdalene and her daughters. If this assertion is true, then their dynasty was by no means exclusively political. Its nature was sacred. Their power did not stem from ecclesiastical institutions, but from the life-giving blood of the Savior. Such an explanation would shed light on many mysteries. Why the Merovingians so stubbornly resisted the hegemony of Rome, why their right to power seemed unshakable, and why their ultimate downfall was caused not by popular will, but was the result of cunning intrigues and betrayal by the papacy and competing dynasties. Chroniclers of the time often contained subtle hints about their extraordinary origin. The legend of King Merovech, from whom the dynasty named itself, tells of his miraculous birth. His mother, during a sea bath, was, according to tradition, visited by a mysterious sea creature, and soon after this event, Merovech was born. Modern historians tend to view this story as pure myth, but it is possible that it was merely an artfully encrypted code, an allegory for a bloodline that was not to be openly acknowledged. If the Merovingians were carriers of the daughter's blood, then their line was the most closely related to the dynasty of Christ that ever existed on the European continent. In such a case, their royal thrones would transform into true altars, and their crowns would serve not merely as symbols of political power, but as signs of a sacred heritage. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Roman Church strove with all its might to overthrow them. By the 8th century, the Merovingians were replaced by representatives of the Carolingian dynasty. Their greatness and legacy visibly faded, and their genealogical branch, as was believed, died out. However, persistent rumors continued to circulate. Some whispered that their descendants managed to survive in deep secrecy, that their bloodline was maintained through marital alliances with noble houses, subtly passed down from generation to generation over centuries. And always in the background loomed the same question. Were the Merovingians just ordinary monarchs from ancient traditions, or did they represent something much more? Were they a secret continuation of the story that the Church tirelessly sought to consign to oblivion? The Daughters of Christ, artfully woven into the very roots of European royal houses. The reliable answer to this question still remains buried under a veil of silence. But perhaps the very persistence with which the legend survives can serve as sufficient circumstantial evidence. For why else would the memory of the Merovingians carry such a deep and captivating resonance, if not because they carried echoes of a forbidden heritage? What if the Holy Grail was never a mere cup? Famous legends tell of valiant knights seeking a chalice, a vessel that collected Christ's precious blood during his crucifixion, or the cup from which he drank wine at the Last Supper. However, some argue that this widely accepted story is merely an ingenious veil, a clever disguise for something far deeper and more mysterious. The true Grail, these thinkers suggest, was not a material object at all, but a bloodline. Not an artifact carved from stone or cast in gold, but rather a woman's womb, which became the cradle for his legitimate heirs. The phrase sang real, traditionally interpreted as Holy Grail, in ancient times could have meant sang royal, royal blood. Over centuries, its true meaning gradually blurred, shifting from a living bloodline to an inanimate cup, from the image of a woman to the image of a goblet. But if we return to the most ancient traditions and hints, then the Grail could well have been Mary Magdalene herself, the sacred vessel who bore Christ's children in exile. And if so, the search for the Grail was never a search for an artifact. It was the preservation of a sacred family and the protection of daughters whose blood carried both human vulnerability and divine heritage. Such an interpretation completely reevaluates well-known medieval romances in a new, even eerie light. Recall the knights who wandered through dense forests and desolate wastes in search of the Grail, their harsh trials, their absolute secrecy, their selfless devotion. Was this not, in essence, a mission of guardianship? Were they not custodians of a sacred truth, seeking not an inanimate object, but living heirs who carried within them the great mystery of divine incarnation itself? And what about the Grail's connection to healing and rebirth? In every tale, finding the Grail means restoring life, healing a wounded land, restoring what was destroyed. Could this be an allegorical symbol of this very bloodline? The idea that the daughters held not just the continuation of Christ's lineage, but also the potential for the renewal of the entire world, for the restoration of a lost balance between the divine, feminine, and masculine principles that had been suppressed for so long and so persistently. The Grail, presented as a cup, is a convenient and safe story to interpret. It reduces a great mystery to the level of a mere relic, an object that can be found, sanctified, or lost again. However, the Grail understood as a womb, as a daughter, as a living and pulsating bloodline, is an idea that carries immense danger. For no church dogma could accept such a truth. No hierarchical structure could control or mediate it. If the Grail were incarnate flesh, then salvation itself would exist outside the power of the Roman Church, in those women who were the bearers of a genealogical line too sacred to ever be officially recognized. Thus, it is not surprising that ancient traditions underwent significant changes. In these reworkings, the Grail transformed from a potentially dangerous, living truth embodied in the flesh into something tangible, a sacred chalice or a stone vessel. Such a metamorphosis, it is believed, was undertaken with the aim of concealing the existence of the daughters, which led to a profound reinterpretation of the historical narrative. The true meanings were carefully veiled in allegories, and the authentic symbols cleverly disguised. Nevertheless, despite all efforts, these symbols continue to secretly whisper their stories. Images of the chalice, the rose, a vessel resembling a womb, carved on the walls of majestic cathedrals, or the figure of the Grail maiden, appearing in ancient tales and offering some mysterious gift to a worthy knight. All of this may serve not just as ornament. These elements, perhaps, are fragments of a collective memory, too powerful to be completely erased from consciousness. They hint that the true Grail was never a material relic to be found, but rather a sacred bloodline requiring constant protection. Therefore, it is quite probable that, when discussing the Grail, humanity is in fact touching upon a topic radically different from generally accepted notions. There is a suggestion that it refers to Magdalene, to her descendants, the daughters, and to a profound mystery that was carefully preserved not in inert stone or sacred scriptures, but in living flesh and blood, remaining hidden, yet in plain sight of the entire world. If we assume that the Grail represented something far more significant than a mere cup, a subsequent equally important question arises. How then was such a vulnerable truth preserved? Obviously, it could not be openly proclaimed, for such declarations would inevitably lead to accusations of heresy, excommunication, or even execution. Instead, the narrative was likely skillfully encrypted in secret codes, woven into the fabric of ancient manuscripts, brightly illuminated in polysemous symbols, and transmitted through whispering allegories. The medieval era deeply valued symbolism, and scribes, diligently copying texts, often embedded hidden messages within them, clothing forbidden truths in multi-layered meanings. Some medieval codices still contain very curious fragments, verses whose arrangement seems unusual, illustrations that at first glance appear superfluous, or patterns that repeat without obvious logic. To the uninitiated eye, all of this appeared merely as decorative ornamentation. However, for those initiated into the secrets, these elements may have served as special signals, signs indicating that fragments of the sacred history of Christ's daughters were hidden on these pages. For example, the surprisingly frequent appearance of images of roses and chalices in high medieval manuscripts. The rose, with its delicate petals spiraling inward, traditionally served as a powerful symbol of the sacred feminine. The chalice, its shape resembling a womb, has long been perceived as a vessel of life, a precious container of being. The question arises, when scribes depicted these symbols together, were they merely decorating the margins of manuscripts, or were they secretly encoding a truth too risky for direct expression? This truth could have been that Christ's bloodline did not end, but continued through a woman, and therefore through her daughters, whose existence remained unrecognized and hidden from the world. These secret coded messages were not limited to the pages of manuscripts. They also appeared in magnificent architecture, embedded in the very stones of grand cathedrals like Chartres or Notre Dame, as well as in numerous hidden chapels scattered throughout Europe. Stained glass windows, radiant with light, and skillfully crafted carved reliefs seem to silently whisper of the sacred feminine. Figures of Magdalene, often cleverly disguised as unnamed saints, gaze perceptively from window openings, her presence simultaneously denied by official doctrine and paradoxically immortalized in stone and glass. Moreover, allegories played an important role. Medieval chivalric romances, telling of valiant knights embarking on quests for mysterious maidens, sacred vessels, lost and rediscovered secrets, could actually have been complex, coded narratives. Their true purpose was to preserve valuable memory in the form of captivating stories, rather than within the strict confines of Scripture. For the general public, these works served as a source of engaging entertainment. However, for those with esoteric knowledge, they represented a form of guardianship, an ingenious way to transmit a profound secret without ever uttering it aloud. Thus, the medieval codex was more than just a collection of pages. It functioned simultaneously as a book and as a secure lock. Words alone, devoid of additional meaning, could not safely preserve such a dangerous truth, which threatened serious consequences. However, when skillfully hidden within lush ornamentation, in ornate initial letters, in subtle images of grapevines and roses, this truth became accessible. A reader possessing eyes that can see, that is, the ability to interpret hidden meanings, could catch a fleeting glimpse of what was strictly forbidden from open expression. A logical question arises. Why take such a risk at all, using such complex codes? The answer lies in understanding that while silence possesses immense power, it cannot suppress memory forever. Those who sincerely believed in the existence of Christ's daughters could not allow this sacred history to completely disappear. Therefore, they carefully coded it, skillfully hid it, and clothed it in allegories, with the hope and faith that someday in the future, someone would be able to decipher it again. And perhaps it is in our time that this decryption process is happening. Every unusual image found in medieval codices, every inexplicable figure frozen in a cathedral window, every story of mysterious maidens and sacred vessels in romantic literature, all of this is potentially fragments of a vast hidden archive, a kind of library of whispers, preserved not in direct words, but in polysemous symbols. And what if, in fact, across Europe, people daily, unknowingly, pass by undeniable evidence of the existence of Christ's daughters, skillfully carved in stone, painted on stained glass, carefully hidden in ancient books, and miraculously survived centuries of upheaval? And what if the true story was never completely destroyed, but merely cleverly veiled, hidden under a layer of oblivion, awaiting the moment when humanity is ready to reread it? If the Grail indeed represented not a material cup, but a sacred bloodline, then the next equally important question arises. What happened to the children themselves, the bearers of this line? The traditions of Languedoc, that mysterious and spectral land located in the south of France, speak of them in the form of intriguing riddles. These are sisters, two young women whose origins are shrouded in deep silence. Their names are rarely spoken aloud, and their faces are never captured in images. And yet, despite this veil of mystery, stories about them continue to live. According to these tales, Magdalene did not arrive in France alone. She brought her daughters with her. In some versions of the narrative, they are described as twins, like mirror images of each other, symbolizing perfect balance, the sacred duality of flesh and spirit, body and soul. To take both of them into exile meant not only preserving Christ's blood, but also ensuring the continuation of the harmony of a lineage deeply rooted in the sacred feminine. Thus, one of the most intriguing questions remains open: what was their subsequent fate? Various traditions tell of the fate of these women. Some claim that they entered into marital alliances with influential families, and their genealogical line subtly merged into the lineages of local rulers. Other versions state that they were secretly taken to mountain refuges, where they were raised by those who would later become known as the Cathars, or Pure Ones, adherents of a teaching that revered Magdalene as a bearer of hidden wisdom. Images of these sisters constantly appear in artistic works and folk tales of the region. Their symbols manifest as double roses carved in stone, two maidens depicted side by side in stained glass, or two enigmatic figures accompanying Magdalene in medieval manuscripts. The question arises, was this a mere coincidence or a carefully encrypted message? It is possible that it was a symbol of the daughters, skillfully hidden in allegory. The official church never mentioned them, yet its silence itself is quite eloquent. For if such daughters had never existed, why did villagers pass their story down through generations in whispers? Why did wandering troubadours compose songs about maidens who carefully guarded the secret of a holy lineage? Why did artists repeatedly turn to the motif of two sisters, as if driven by some internal necessity to preserve a memory so fragile that it could not be spoken aloud? Perhaps the sisters were not merely living people of flesh and blood, but symbols of something much more significant. They could represent the duality of a sacred heritage, that which was hidden and revealed, forgotten and preserved. One sister, perhaps, remained in legends, while the other was erased from chronicles, like countless women throughout the centuries, and yet, to whisper of their existence is to keep them alive in collective memory. The story of the two sisters will probably never be definitively proven. Their names may never be returned to their descendants. However, in the ancient stones of Languedoc, in the rich folklore of Provence, in the symbols carved on the walls of churches that stand to this day, their memory continues to live. Perhaps they were real individuals. Perhaps they were a myth. Or perhaps they combined both, a story born of truth, wrapped in allegory, and transmitted in silence, so that even now, centuries later, their faint voices still reach us, the voices of Christ's hidden daughters. If Magdalene's daughters indeed survived in the hills of France, who protected them from Rome's all-seeing eye, the Cathars, these enigmatic pure ones of Languedoc, could well have been their guardians. Emerging in the 12th century, they dared to challenge the authority of the official church, preaching a hidden wisdom, a faith older than Rome's, and a reverence for the feminine principle that undermined the established patriarchal order. The Cathars held a belief in two realms, one spiritual and good, the other material and corrupt. They rejected the pomp of the clergy hierarchy, preferring to live modest lives, often in secrecy. They elevated women to an equal standing, even recognizing them as spiritual leaders, which the Church condemned as heresy. And in their profound veneration of Mary Magdalene, some researchers see something more than mere reverence. They sense in it an echo of memory. Could it be that the Cathars preserved not only her teachings, but also her bloodline? The villages of Occitania, where Catharism flourished, remarkably coincide with the same regions where legends of Magdalene and her daughters persist to this day. The caves of Saint-Baume, the picturesque shores of Provence, the hills of Languedoc. All these places hold the memory of her presence. For the Cathars, she was not a repentant sinner, but a holy teacher. Perhaps even the Grail itself. If they were aware of her daughters, they likely considered themselves their protectors, chosen to guard this secret from relentless persecution by Rome. The Church's response was merciless. The Albigensian crusade of the 13th century aimed at the complete annihilation of the Cathars. Pope Innocent III declared them enemies of Christ, sending armies to burn their cities, slaughter their people, and completely erase their faith from history. Entire settlements were destroyed in the name of eradicating heresy. In Béziers, crusaders asking how to distinguish a heretic from a believer received the famous reply, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Why such fury? Perhaps because the Cathars preserved something more than just a lineage. Perhaps because they carried a memory too dangerous for Rome. The whisper of Christ's daughters, of a living lineage hidden among them. Even the rumor of such a truth would have undermined the entire edifice of church power. In their last stronghold, the fortress of Montségur, the Cathars resisted until 1244, when the fortification fell, and hundreds of them were burned alive. However, legend tells of a small group that escaped under the cover of night, carrying with them a certain treasure. The nature of this treasure was never revealed. Some claim it was gold, others valuable manuscripts, still others the Grail itself. But if the Grail was not a material cup, what then did they carry? Perhaps it was knowledge. Perhaps it was a genealogy. It is not excluded that this treasure was the living heiresses of Magdalene's daughters, once again taken into secrecy, hidden where Rome could never reach. The Cathars were destroyed, but their memory lives on, like an unhealed wound in the history of France. And in their story, one can glimpse faint outlines of a role far more significant than mere heresy. Perhaps they were the last open guardians of a secret bloodline. A bloodline erased by fire, but not extinguished, for blood does not burn, and memory, once carried into exile, has a remarkable ability to survive. High in the Pyrenees, on a solitary mountaintop, rise the ruins of Montségur. For the official church, it was a fortress of heretics. For legend, it became the last sanctuary of a secret. In 1244, after a months-long siege, Montségur fell. 200 Cathars, who refused to recant their faith, were led down the mountain and burned alive on a massive wooden pyre. The flames consumed them, and with them, it seemed, the last visible stronghold of Cathar faith. But even as the fortress fell, the story persisted that on the night before the final surrender, a small group of Cathars managed to slip unnoticed through the siege lines, carrying with them a hidden treasure. Neither gold, nor precious stones, nor any other material valuables that the Catholic Church might consider wealth, were ever found. This inevitably leads to the question, what then was carried out of the fortress? Some researchers claim it was sacred scriptures, ancient texts containing knowledge that the Roman Empire sought to eradicate. Others are inclined to assume it was a relic, an artifact whose history went deeper than the very existence of Montségur. And still others insist that the object of salvation was not an object, but a living being, a direct descendant. For if the Cathars truly bore the burden of preserving Christ's hidden bloodline, then Montségur represented much more than just an impregnable fortress. It was a sacred cradle, a refuge where memory was carefully guarded, where the whisper of Magdalene's daughters was passed down through generations for centuries. And when the fires of the Inquisition blazed on the mountain slopes, it is entirely possible that the guardians ensured that the most sacred was carried away under the cover of night. The flames that rose over Montségur were meant to erase all traces. They were meant to silence. They were meant to destroy without a trace. However, fire does not always merely consume. Sometimes it illuminates. And in the tragedy of the Cathar burning, a legend was born that could never truly fade. Even today, pilgrims continue their arduous ascent up the steep path to the picturesque ruins of Montségur. They stand among the ancient stones, listening to the wind whistling over the mountain peaks. Some claim to feel an invisible presence there, as if the memory of the fallen still lingers in the air. Others hear whispers carried by the currents, a reminder that sacred secrets do not perish in fire. What was the true last flame of Montségur? Was it merely the flame of martyrdom? Or was it the light of a hidden lineage, carried away in silence? Did the treasure manage to escape that night, to hide forever in secluded valleys and forgotten villages, awaiting the moment when the world would be ready to remember? No one knows the exact answer. However, perhaps the true treasure of Montségur was not meant to be found. Perhaps its purpose was survival, not as a material possession, but as a living memory, as a bloodline, as the whisper of daughters whose existence was too dangerous to be named aloud. The ashes of Montségur still rest in the soil of France, and in these ashes, some believe, the secret of Christ's hidden bloodline still smolders, waiting for the wind of curiosity to fan it into a bright flame again. If the treasure of Montségur was indeed carried away, where could its memory have been safely hidden? It should be sought not in golden vaults or majestic Roman cathedrals, but among the stones of forgotten chapels, in the intricate carvings of monasteries, in the silent yet eloquent geometry of medieval architecture. For stone, unlike fragile parchment, is not so easily consumed by fire. Therefore, many are convinced that those who guarded the secret of Christ's daughters left their testimony precisely in stone. Throughout southern France, in churches connected in some way to Magdalene's name, unusual carvings can be found. Here are two roses placed side by side. Here is a chalice, womb-shaped in its outline. Here are two maidens holding a single crown. To ordinary parishioners, these images might seem merely decorative elements, but to the initiated, they could have served as fragments of memory, coded reminders of a bloodline so sacred that speaking of it aloud was dangerous. Consider, for example, the crypt of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, where tradition holds that Magdalene's relics are preserved. Its walls whisper with symbols, roses, grapevines, and female figures not mentioned in canonical scriptures. Some scholars see this as mere ornamentation. Others wonder if these images are not silent testimonies, traces of daughters whose names were never recorded, but whose presence was preserved. The Templars also left their undeniable mark in stone. In the chapels they built across Europe, curious images are found. Knights kneeling before a mysterious woman, double figures guarding a central flame, hidden roses artfully carved into arches. Were these merely whims of medieval art? Or were they signs of guardianship, quiet acknowledgments of a bloodline they vowed to protect? Even the grand cathedrals of Notre Dame hold their secrets. Among the fearsome gargoyles and pious saints, one can find figures of women whose identity remains ambiguous, and whose gestures hint at hidden roles. Could it be that the very buildings, which people pass in silence, are stone libraries where each carving is a page in the book of a forgotten lineage? The builders knew what they could not express in words. Parchment could be burned, names erased, sermons rewritten, but stone withstands the test of time. Stone remembers, stone waits. And in the shadows of monasteries, in the faces of statues, in the orientation of windows to the stars, perhaps the truth was preserved in plain sight for those ready to see it. And what if every church dedicated to Magdalene is more than just an act of piety? What if it is a pointer, a kind of map indicating a bloodline once hidden in these valleys and hills? What if the very architecture of Europe is a complex code, a network of symbols left by those who could not speak openly but refused to let history die? Stone cannot speak, but it can whisper. And in that whisper, some believe, lies the memory of Christ's hidden daughters, erased by Rome, but forever preserved in the silent testimony of stone. If the Cathars perished in the fire, and the guardianship of Christ's bloodline seemed lost, who then took up the mantle of protection? The answer, some believe, lies with the Knights Templar. Founded in the 12th century as monk warriors to protect pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, the Templars quickly amassed immense wealth, gained enormous power, and became shrouded in a thick veil of mystery. Within a single century, they controlled vast holdings, possessed secret knowledge, and wielded influence that rivaled the power of kings. Their sudden and rapid rise has long puzzled historians. Where did their immense treasures come from? What gave them such power, feared and envied even by monarchs? One intriguing theory tells of a grand discovery. According to these assumptions, deep beneath the ruins of the ancient Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the Knights Templar dug and explored secret tunnels. Chronicles and traditions hint that their search was focused not on the gleam of golden treasures, but on something immeasurably more significant and mysterious. Some researchers believe they discovered ancient documents, sacred relics, or genealogical records directly connected to the very origins of Christianity. Others are convinced that the Templars found undeniable proof of Christ's bloodline, specifically records of Magdalene and her daughters, which had been carefully preserved in deep secrecy since the time of exile. If these conjectures are true, then the Templars transcended their role as valiant warriors, transforming into silent guardians of a forbidden and extremely dangerous legacy. Their famous seal, depicting two knights riding one horse, is often interpreted as a symbol of deep duality, perhaps even a hint at those very two daughters so quietly whispered about in the lands of Languedoc. The red cross, vividly standing out against the impeccably white background of their robes, symbolized the sacred union of blood and purity, inextricably linked. One cannot ignore their very complex relationship with the Church. Initially, the order received full approval and support from the papacy, but over time, the Templars became too powerful, too independent, which could not but cause apprehension among the highest ecclesiastical hierarchs. By the early 14th century, the powerful King Philip IV of France, being largely indebted to the order, made the irreversible decision to destroy it. With the Pope's extremely reluctant blessing, the Templars were accused of heresy, subjected to mass arrests, brutal torture, and ultimately burned at the stake. The question arises, why such unprecedented cruelty? Was it merely common greed, A simple desire of the monarch to seize their immense wealth? Or was something much deeper and more sinister hidden behind it? Could the Templars have possessed a truth that was too dangerous to allow it to come to light? The truth of a surviving bloodline of Christ, still alive, still carefully guarded, beyond the reach and control of Rome. According to tradition, on the night preceding their mass arrests in 1307, some Templars managed to escape, carrying with them certain treasures that remain undiscovered to this day. Some believe it was ordinary gold removed from the order's treasury. Others claim it was the legendary Grail. But if we assume that the Grail symbolized the bloodline itself, then perhaps what they carried was not a material object, but an invaluable memory or even living descendants of Christ's hidden heirs. Thus, even in their complete destruction, their great secret managed to survive. The legacy of the Templars transformed over centuries into a rich tapestry of legends, inspiring the creation of numerous secret societies, encoded symbols, and giving rise to mysterious connections with later esoteric orders. Some researchers claim that the Masons, centuries later, inherited fragments of their guardianship and mission. Others persistently assert that the Templars never truly disappeared, but merely went deep underground, continuing their silent and tireless protection of a lineage that the Church so desperately tried to erase from the face of the earth. The Templars are remembered as fearless warriors, skilled bankers, and of course, as heretics. But perhaps, in reality, they were something much more. Perhaps they were the guardians of the daughters, the guardians of that very bloodline that could not be spoken aloud, but that could not be destroyed. And if so, then their silence is not an absence of information. It is a powerful shield, a silence that still carefully guards a great secret, patiently awaiting its full disclosure. If the Templars truly held the secret of Christ's hidden heirs, why did the Church so ruthlessly turn against them? The answer to this question may lie not only in mundane greed, but in a deep, all-consuming fear. For if a bloodline originating from Magdalene had truly survived, Rome's very power would have been utterly undermined. The papacy's claims were based on its being the sole and undisputed representative of Christ on earth. But if his descendants still lived among people, heirs of flesh and blood, carrying his lineage, then the Pope would not be his vicar, but his direct rival. And that is why betrayal followed so swiftly and mercilessly. On that fateful Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France dealt the first crushing blow. With the Pope's silent approval, he ordered the sudden arrest of all Templars in his kingdom. Throughout Europe, knights were dragged from their commanderies, shackled in heavy chains, subjected to horrific torture, and accused of blasphemy. They were charged with spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and, of course, heresy. But behind these accusations lies a profound question. Were they truly guilty of a secret they had not yet fully understood? Perhaps the true heresy of the Templars was not what they believed, but what they knew. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, but not before cursing both the king and the Pope, declaring that they would soon face God's judgment. Indeed, both men died within a year. For some, this was a mere coincidence. For others, it became a sign that the Templars carried with them not only secrets, but a divine mandate, a protection that even all-consuming fire could not erase. And what if the accusations of heresy merely masked a deeper and more pervasive fear? What if Rome truly feared that the Templars had discovered or even sheltered descendants of Christ's daughters? What if these descendants were quietly living in France, skillfully woven into noble families, carefully guarded by knights sworn to keep this secret? This would explain the unprecedented cruelty of their suppression. It would explain why the papacy, often cautious, acted with such finality to erase them from the face of the earth. For the existence of Christ's bloodline would destroy the very foundations of the Church. Salvation, offered through an institution, mediated by priests, would be called into question by the living presence of his heirs. However, silence does not always mean complete success. The destruction of the Templar order may have burned their organization, but it could not burn the bloodline they so devotedly guarded. If the daughters survived, they would already have been carefully hidden, merged with families whose names would arouse no suspicion. Thus, the betrayal may have failed in its primary goal, leaving Rome triumphant only externally, but powerless against a deeper and indestructible legacy of blood. Historical memory has cast the Templars as victims of greed and royal envy. However, there is a suggestion that their true betrayal lay in something far deeper, in something that official chronicles could not capture. This refers to the betrayal of those who guarded a truth so dangerous that its revelation could shake the world to its core. This truth was attempted to be suppressed by the fires of the Inquisition and numerous accusations, but it continued to exist, passed down by word of mouth and whispers, completely beyond Rome's control. And perhaps, even today, humanity continues to feel the echoes of that ancient betrayal. A natural question arises. Why has the Vatican, whose archives are a repository of documents older than any earthly kingdom, persistently remained silent in response to these insistent whispers concerning a bloodline and lineage, deep beneath majestic Rome, in vast vaults said to stretch for miles? Countless manuscripts, ancient codices, and scrolls are hidden from prying eyes. Some of these priceless artifacts date back to the very first centuries of Christianity. Others are letters, gospels, and testaments that were officially declared apocryphal because their content proved too dangerous to uphold the widely accepted ecclesiastical narrative. If Christ's bloodline truly existed, if Magdalene's daughters left behind even the slightest evidence, could this proof have been buried precisely here, beneath centuries of the strictest secrecy? For many centuries, the Church has extremely carefully and consciously shaped humanity's historical memory. Some texts were elevated to canonical status, gaining the status of sacred scriptures, while others were strictly forbidden from dissemination and study. For example, the Gnostic Gospels, which presented Magdalene not merely as a follower, but as Christ's direct companion, were resolutely excluded from the official canon. Entire currents and traditions of early Christianity were condemned as heresies, and each such choice inexorably determined what was allowed to be remembered and what was to be consigned to oblivion. A logical question arises: why? Probably because the mere acknowledgement of Christ's bloodline could instantly shatter the centuries-old theological foundations upon which all church doctrine rested. For if the Savior had direct descendants, the boundary separating the mortal and the divine would inevitably blur, losing its clarity. In such a case, salvation would become accessible not exclusively through church sacraments, through the mediation of priests and popes, but also through the very lives of his descendants. The Church's power, based on its exclusive role as mediator in the transmission of divine grace, would inevitably be shaken, losing its absolute character. This is why maintaining profound silence seemed a much safer path. It was far preferable to immortalize Magdalene as a repentant sinner, forever bowed in humble penitence, than to recognize her as the mother of daughters in whose veins flowed the blood of Christ. It was far more advantageous to exalt her as the forgiven one than to preserve the memory of her as the sacred vessel of his lineage. And it was even safer to carefully conceal the possibility that the true Grail was not a material cup, but the very womb that held this sacred progeny. However, this profound silence, paradoxically, tells its own story. For behind every act of erasure, subtle traces remain. Despite all efforts, at least a fragment of every forbidden gospel has survived. Behind every decree of suppression, the legend continues to live in people's hearts, in village traditions, in works of art, and in the songs of troubadours who skillfully weave ancient memory into poetic lines. If the Vatican consciously chose the path of silence, it could only mean one thing. It had something to hide. Whispers tell of sealed documents that were locked away for centuries and accessible only to the highest ranks of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It speaks of gospels detailing Christ's companions, of genealogies carefully tracing bloodlines in Gaul, of reports concerning sects like the Cathars, who spoke too freely of Magdalene. The question arises, are all these stories merely products of human imagination, or are they genuine echoes of ancient papers, hidden in darkness and carefully guarded precisely because they can reveal too much? It is entirely possible that the Vatican will never decide to reveal to the world what is carefully kept in its vast archives. This profound silence may continue for many more centuries. However, such silence cannot erase memory. It only deepens the surrounding mystery. And that is why we are left with questions that the Vatican, it seems, will never answer. These are questions buried in deep shadows, silent in corridors lined with ancient parchment and centuries of dust. Did Christ leave behind daughters? Did Magdalene bring them with her into exile? And do their descendants still walk among us, unnoticed in the crowd? The Vatican maintains an unbreakable silence, but this very silence eloquently whispers its story. If the Vatican consciously chose the path of silence, then undoubtedly it also chose the path of fire. The Inquisition, born in the 12th century and methodically refined in subsequent centuries, became the sharpest blade of ecclesiastical control. Its primary task seemed utterly simple and clear: to identify and eradicate heresy, suppress any dissent, and completely erase from memory any belief that fell outside the strictly defined boundaries of Rome's chosen doctrine. However, beneath this outward mission of maintaining religious purity lay a much deeper and more unsettling question. What specific truths were subjected to such merciless hunting? The Cathars, as already shown, were completely annihilated with furious zeal. Mystics who allowed themselves to speak too freely of Magdalene were promptly silenced. Scholars who showed excessive interest in apocryphal texts and paid too much attention to them were condemned. Families rumored to possess unusual genealogies suddenly found themselves under suspicion. What if this endless fire of the Inquisition was kindled not only by theological disagreements, but by questions of blood? Christ's hidden daughters, if they truly existed and lived, could never be officially recognized. Their revelation would inevitably undermine and destroy the very foundations of church power. And so, if the slightest whisper arose, if anyone dared even to suggest that Christ's bloodline was still present among people, the Inquisition was on alert, ready for immediate action. Accusations came swiftly and mercilessly, often based on the most trivial and contrived pretexts. A recounted dream, a simple symbol drawn in the margins of a manuscript, or even a kinship with lands where the Cathar movement once flourished, was enough. The accused were immediately dragged into dark dungeons, where they were subjected to the cruelest tortures until the desired confession was extracted from them. Then, these very words, extorted under torture, were used for their final condemnation. After that, the fires of the pyres ensued. Thus, an all-encompassing silence was enforced. Rumors circulated that entire libraries were destroyed and priceless manuscripts burned to ashes. These manuscripts could have contained traces of long-forgotten gospels or genealogies that linked noble European families to Gaul, to Magdalene, and perhaps even to Christ himself. What knowledge turned to ash? What names were lost to humanity forever? However, every suppression contains a paradox. The more forcefully and persistently attempts are made to erase something from memory, the more tenaciously and persistently that memory clings. Thus, whispers continued to live in folklore. Symbols were preserved, skillfully woven into works of art. Genealogies, meanwhile, were carefully kept in deep secrecy, hidden within the walls of noble houses, where they were quietly passed down from generation to generation, never again risking being put to parchment. The Inquisition, with its monstrous power, could burn bodies and books, but it was powerless to burn blood. And that is why the very existence of such a powerful and ruthless apparatus as the Inquisition eloquently testifies to a hidden fear. Why was so much fire and destruction needed for a faith that was already firmly established? Why cause so much devastation if there was truly nothing to hide? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that the Church was not merely fighting heresy, but much more deeply, it was concealing an entire chapter of history. Over the historical landscape of Europe, the invisible smoke of the Inquisition still lingers. It reminds us of devastated villages, names consigned to oblivion, and silenced voices. And yet, one undeniable fact that ecclesiastical authority sought to consign to oblivion, the potential existence of Christ's daughters, stubbornly refuses to remain buried. For absolute silence is unattainable, and even the cooled ashes, disturbed by the wind, now and then whisper ancient secrets. What if the truth was never lost, but merely hidden in plain sight? Throughout the Middle Ages, noble families across Europe meticulously kept their genealogical records. Scrolls of lineage were carefully copied and preserved, tracing ancestors through many generations of lords and ladies. These dossiers served not only as a source of family pride, but also as a powerful tool for asserting legitimacy, irrefutable proof of inheritance, land rights, and claims to power. However, some of these genealogies appear mysteriously incomplete. Certain branches end without apparent reason. Others bear intriguing marks in their margins: roses, chalices, double figures, symbols that seem less like decorations and more like silent reminders of something sacred. Could it be that fragments of Christ's secret bloodline were hidden precisely within these genealogies? Notable, for example, are the dynasties of southern France, many of whom showed defiance to Rome's authority and maintained pronounced independence. Their family trees sometimes traced their roots to obscure origins, to ancestors described in vague allegorical terms. Was this simply a fading of memory or a deliberate veil? Could these noble houses have integrated the descendants of the daughters, merging the sacred blood with their own lineage, while carefully veiling the truth from the vigilant eye of the churchman? Marriage provided perfect cover. A daughter of Christ could be married into a powerful family. Her name would fade into oblivion, but her blood would continue to flow through the veins of dukes, counts, and ultimately kings. To openly declare such an origin would have been deadly. It was much safer to cloak it in allegorical forms, using symbols, cryptic records, or elegant emblems. It is significant that some family coats of arms feature roses intertwined with chalices, or stars paired with crescent moons. These images, unusual for Christian heraldry, are nevertheless consistently present in certain regions. To the uninitiated, they appear as simple ornamentation. To the informed, however, they may have been silent testimonies. The hidden blood flows here. Even the poetry of the troubadours contains hints of forgotten genealogies. Songs of the courtly love tradition speak of maidens guarding sacred secrets, of noble ladies likened to roses blooming in seclusion, whose true value is hidden from all but the most faithful knight. Were these merely romantic verses, or cleverly veiled testimonies of a bloodline passed down in whispers? The church controlled written records, but families guarded their memory. Within castles and fortresses, in rooms where no inquisitor could penetrate, whispers were heard. Stories could be preserved without ever being written down, always spoken, always transmitted to future generations. And so, although many genealogies seem fragmented, perhaps the true line never broke. Could the kings and queens of subsequent centuries have unwittingly been carriers of Christ's blood? Could dynasties across Europe have been founded not only on conquest, but also on the inheritance of a sacred bloodline, erased from official annals? We cannot know for sure, but the missing links in Europe's genealogies suggest something more than mere forgetfulness. They hint at deliberate erasure, and such erasure often points to a truth too dangerous for open proclamation. Perhaps the bloodline of Christ's daughters was not eradicated, but carefully masked. And perhaps in ways we cannot fully trace, it continues to flow even now, hidden beneath centuries of ink, fire, and silence. If noble genealogies concealed a bloodline, then what about the crowns of Europe? For centuries, kings and queens proclaimed a divine right to rule. Some justified their legitimacy by papal anointing, others by military triumphs. But what if another, far more deeply hidden foundation served as the basis of their power? What if Christ's secret bloodline was already woven into the fabric of Europe's royal dynasties? The Merovingians were the first to be whispered about as potential heirs, but perhaps they were not the last in this line. Through marriages and alliances, their descendants merged with other dynasties, and their sacred blood spread through thrones and courts. By the Middle Ages, it became plausible that kings and queens carried a forgotten heritage, possessing a claim more weighty than papal coronation, a claim rooted in the very flesh of Christ. Could it be that this is why monarchs so jealously guarded their family trees? Why some genealogies trace their origins to myths, asserting their legitimacy in ancient traditions? Could it be that this is why some crowns, like the French, were imbued with a sacred aura that even Rome could not fully diminish? The union of Christ's hidden blood with secular power would inevitably have terrified the Church. A king who could claim descent not only from noble ancestors, but from Christ himself, would fall outside the jurisdiction of the papacy. His rule would be consecrated by the flesh itself, not solely by sacrament, and if queens carried this blood, then their children, the princes and princesses of Europe, would become living embodiments of a legacy that Rome sought to consign to complete oblivion. It is suggested that some traditions even point to the Stuarts of Scotland, and subsequently England, as bearers of echoes of this enigmatic heritage. Their deep fascination with sacred symbols, their notable resistance to papal Rome, their firm belief in the divine right to rule, all of this could serve as an echo of a memory they may never have fully understood or named. Moreover, in France, rumors persistently circulated that the Capetian and Bourbon dynasties also carried Merovingian blood, which in turn implied something much deeper, a heritage inextricably linked to Magdalene's daughters. Regardless of whether these claims were true, the fear of such assertions relentlessly haunted Rome, for it would mean the emergence of a power not consecrated by its blessing. A power rooted not in papal authority, but in a hidden bloodline over which the Church would be completely powerless. And what if the ruling houses of Europe were aware of this secret, even if they never dared to speak of it aloud? What if, behind all the lavish ceremonies and strict rituals, there was a quiet but profound awareness that their legitimacy stemmed not only from conquests or traditional coronations, but from some sacred origin, carefully preserved for many centuries? If so, then the bloodline of Christ's daughters did not disappear at all. It rose from secluded villages to exquisite noble courts, from forgotten genealogies to royal thrones, from silence to crowns, and perhaps even in our time, this legacy continues to exist, not in ancient relics or dusty archives, but in living descendants who unknowingly step into the shadows of a long-forgotten heritage. If there is one place where all these whispers and conjectures converge, it is undoubtedly Rennes-le-Château. This tiny village in the south of France, picturesquely situated on a solitary hill, holds a mystery that has haunted seekers of truth for over a century. In the late 19th century, specifically in the 1800s, a local parish priest, Béranger Saunière, stumbled upon something that forever changed his life and the fate of this secluded place. The details of this discovery remain very vague, shrouded in a dense veil of rumors and countless speculations. Some claim he discovered ancient parchments, skillfully hidden in the church walls, documents that hinted at a bloodline long erased from official history. Others lean towards the idea that he unearthed a treasure, consisting not of gold, but of priceless knowledge, possibly related to Christ himself and Magdalene. Whatever it was, Saunière suddenly and inexplicably became rich. With the funds obtained, he renovated his church, adding strange extensions filled with unusual symbols, images of devils, angels, and Magdalene, sorrowfully weeping at the foot of the cross. Why such unusual images in a quiet parish, far from Rome's watchful eye? The answer, some believe, is that Saunière uncovered evidence of Christ's descendants. Rennes-le-Château is located in the very heart of Cathar country, a region where legends of Magdalene and her daughters have been preserved for many centuries. The village itself is situated amidst a landscape dotted with ancient ruins, mysterious caves, and old chapels that were once associated with the cult of the saint. If the daughters indeed lived, if their bloodline was preserved, then this region, remote, mountainous, and fiercely independent, represented an ideal cradle for their heritage. This is why the story stubbornly persists that Saunière, while renovating his church, touched upon a secret that survived the Inquisition, withstood the fall of Montségur, and overcame centuries of suppression. His sudden wealth, his mysterious and unusual renovations, his general secrecy, were all these not clear signs of a man who stumbled upon a forbidden truth and was, perhaps, handsomely paid by some hidden forces to keep it secret? Pilgrims still flocked to Rennes-le-Château, wandering its narrow, winding streets, carefully examining the strange inscriptions and ornate carvings left by Saunière. They paused before the church of Mary Magdalene, wondering what he found and why he never openly spoke of this discovery. Some claim that the secret is still kept within the village itself, hidden under stone or securely sealed in secret vaults. Others believe that Saunière passed it on to secret societies, those guardians of the bloodline whose existence should never be revealed too openly. And some whisper that Christ's descendants may still walk among us, their bloodline quietly traced back to the hills of Rennes. Rennes-le-Château remains an unfathomable enigma, a knot of history where treasure, bloodline, and forbidden memory are intricately intertwined. And perhaps this is entirely fitting, for if Christ's daughters ever lived, if their bloodline truly survived, where else should their legacy rest? If not in a village situated on the edge of history and myth, where silence and secrecy have always been the most reliable guardians. Among all the symbols whispered about for centuries, none speaks so clearly of a hidden bloodline as the rose and the chalice. The rose, long before it became merely an emblem of beauty, held deep sacred significance. Its petals spiral inward, like a secret securely hiding its heart. In medieval mythology, the rose symbolized secrecy. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, meant a truth spoken but never written, a confidence to be kept in the deepest secrecy. What better symbol for a bloodline that could never be openly recorded in public chronicles? The chalice also carries many layers of meaning. As the Grail, it was presented as a vessel of divine presence, the cup of Christ's blood. But in its form lies another truth. It symbolizes the vessel of life, the womb, the sacred feminine. To unite the rose and the chalice is to whisper of Magdalene and her daughters, of a secret womb that gave the world Christ's hidden heirs. Together, these symbols appear again and again in coats of arms, carved into cathedral stones, drawn in ancient manuscripts. A rose in a chalice crowned with roses, a maiden holding a chalice adorned with petals. To the casual glance, this is merely decorative ornamentation. To the knowing eye, it is a complex cipher. Even secret societies that emerged after the fall of the Templars used these emblems. The Rosicrucians, the Order of the Rose and the Cross, spoke of hidden wisdom, of secret knowledge carefully preserved from deep antiquity. The question arises whether the rose concealed in its petals not only mysterious truths, but also echoes of the memory of an ancient bloodline. Did the chalice, used in their mysterious rituals, serve as a symbol of Magdalene's womb, revered in deep silence, but categorically rejected by official Rome? It is noteworthy how the image of the rose permeates the architecture of majestic cathedrals. These magnificent rose windows, Enormous circles of colored glass radiate dazzling beauty. Standing before one of these masterpieces, one involuntarily experiences both deep reverence and an inexplicable mystery. But what if their significance extends far beyond mere artwork? What if each rose window represents a silent proclamation, a grand wheel of light that wordlessly declares what cannot be spoken aloud? That Christ's legacy continued to live not only in heavenly realms, but in earthly blood, carefully passed down through his daughters. These enigmatic symbols continue to exist through the centuries because they possess a remarkable quality. They simultaneously conceal and reveal profound truths. Their outward display seems safe, yet their true meaning harbors significant danger. They serve as a silent channel for transmitting memory, allowing it to survive despite the fires of pyres, the brutality of the Inquisition, and centuries of suppression. The rose, in its silent presence, seems to whisper ancient stories. The chalice, despite its apparent emptiness, promises a certain fullness and completeness. Together, these two symbols tell a narrative that the official church never wished to make public. Therefore, when you see a rose window glowing at dusk, or notice a chalice skillfully carved into ancient stone, it is worth pausing for a moment. For before your eyes appears not just a decorative element, but a genuine testimony. It is a testimony left to us by those who were denied the opportunity to speak openly, but who categorically refused to let memory fade. The rose and the chalice, mystery and its vessel, Magdalene and her daughters. Perhaps these are the most truthful symbols of the bloodline that was carefully erased from history, but never forgotten. If we assume that the bloodline of Christ's daughters posed too serious a threat to Rome, then it is quite likely that its preservation did not occur in public churches, but in carefully hidden brotherhoods. After the tragic fall of the Knights Templar, rumors of their secret knowledge did not vanish into thin air. On the contrary, these echoes seem to seep and spread among other orders and closed communities that arose throughout Europe. The Rosicrucians, the Masons, as well as invisible networks of alchemists and mystics, all used symbols that surprisingly resonated with ancient traditions, roses, chalices, stars, and references to hidden genealogies. The Rosicrucians, in their teachings, often referred to the symbols of the rose and the cross, which for them were emblems of hidden wisdom. In their interpretation, the rose symbolized secrecy and mystery, while the cross represented transformation and spiritual transfiguration. However, an intriguing question arises. Could their unity also serve as a reflection of a long-denied marriage and evidence of a preserved bloodline? Some researchers believe that the Rosicrucians may have been guardians of fragments of the Templar legacy, possessing knowledge of a sacred lineage whose roots trace back to Magdalene. The Masons are also shrouded in a dense veil of mystery. These renowned cathedral builders, virtuoso masters of symbols, and careful keepers of rituals passed down through generations, constitute an enigmatic community. Their lodges abound with signs of duality, sacred geometry, and cleverly veiled allegories. The question arises, did they inherit not only outstanding architectural skill, but also a certain memory, deeply encoded in stone, the very memory of Christ's hidden heirs, which the Templars once so zealously guarded? In the rituals of these societies, symbols appear with unmistakable clarity. The compass and square, for example, indicate fundamental principles of balance and unity. The letter G shrouded in an aura of mystery, is traditionally interpreted as an abbreviation for geometry or God. However, some whisper that its true meaning is different. Generation, a reference to the mystery of blood, to a sacred lineage hidden in the very flesh. Even alchemists, immersed in their unusual formulas and esoteric practices, sought something more than the mere transmutation of metals. Their tireless search for the philosopher's stone, promising eternal life hidden in matter, may well be an echo of the same deep aspiration, the preservation of sacred heritage in living form, the transformation of blood into an enduring legacy. The common denominator uniting all these societies is their profound silence. None of their members speak directly, preferring to conceal their knowledge behind a screen of symbols and complex allegories. Perhaps this is because the truth they so zealously guard cannot be revealed without the risk of destroying the very foundation of the world around them. The question arises, could these secret societies never have been merely intellectual circles or ordinary guilds of builders, but were in fact guardians? Guardians of ancient whispers, entrusted with protecting the most dangerous knowledge of all possible. Is it possible that throughout centuries of wars, brutal suppressions, and numerous betrayals, they ensured the preservation of this bloodline, skillfully hidden behind masks of rituals and symbols? Their influence is felt even today. It manifests in architectural forms, in ancient legends, and in the invisible yet powerful force they are said to possess. Perhaps they are still watching. Perhaps their mission as guardians has never ended. Perhaps even now, behind tightly closed doors, the story of Christ's daughters is known. Their descendants are protected, and their memory is carefully preserved. And if so, then the echoes of Magdalene's children continue to resound. They are heard not within church walls, but in communities thriving in deep silence, not in sacred scriptures, but in polysemous symbols, not in the bright light of day, but in the mysterious shadows where secrets have always found refuge and survived. Thus, the narrative brings us back to the original question with which this intellectual journey began. Did Christ truly leave behind daughters, hidden heiresses whose very existence could shatter the very foundations of church doctrine? From the picturesque shores of Provence to the majestic ruins of Montségur, from enigmatic symbols carved in ancient stone to deeply buried secrets held in the Vatican archives, from the meticulously documented genealogies of noble European houses to the faint whispers of secret societies, everywhere a trace persists. Each of these threads, fragile in itself, weaves into a single complex tapestry that points more to an inherited memory than to a simple myth. This is a story that has proven too resilient and too widespread to be easily dismissed as mere fiction. The official church, in its time, silenced Magdalene, transforming her from a respected teacher into a repentant sinner. The Inquisition ruthlessly burned those who dared to revere her. The Templars were treacherously betrayed, their powerful order destroyed, and their secrets seemed to vanish forever in the flames. And yet, despite all these efforts, the whisper lives on. A whisper of sisters, a whisper of heirs, a whisper of an ancient bloodline that was diligently erased from official chronicles, but was never completely expunged from the world. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of all this lies precisely in the persistence and tenacity of this silence. For if there was nothing worth hiding, then why were such colossal efforts made to destroy? Why such furious zeal, such all-consuming fire, such long centuries of suppression? Analysts and researchers often wonder why images of roses and chalices, twins and closed societies appear so persistently and ubiquitously in centuries of European art, architectural masterpieces, and folklore. It is possible that the true Grail was never a material vessel, but symbolized a womb, a source of new life. Perhaps the most precious of all holy relics was life itself, humbly and secretly passed down from generation to generation through daughters whose names were never recorded in the annals of history, but whose blood, nevertheless, continues to pulse in the present. No one can claim with absolute certainty, for the annals of past eras have concealed too many facts, and those who guarded this silence acted with exceptional foresight. However, perhaps absolute clarity was never meant for humanity. There is a suggestion that the mystery itself represents the true legacy, a whisper that prompts us to listen deeper, encourages us to wonder and question what lies beyond commonly accepted narratives. For ultimately, the Daughters of Christ can be understood not so much as a direct genealogy, but as an embodiment of memory, not so much as blood kinship, but as unlimited possibility. They symbolize what was hidden, are silent witnesses to what caused apprehension, and represent a silence whose eloquence surpasses any words. So when deep night falls and the world around us plunges into silence, we are invited to reflect on this enigma. One can imagine daughters passing through the twists and turns of history, remaining unnoticed, their invisible presence transmitted, like a sacred fire, from century to century. We should heed this whisper, for even if the ultimate truth remains beyond humanity's reach, history itself has been preserved as an unbreakable thread that permeates centuries of oblivion. Perhaps this thread continues to unravel, extending even now into modernity. Perhaps one day, when the world is ready to perceive it, it will appear in its true form. Until then, the mystery remains. Christ's hidden daughters, forgotten by chronicles, yet never completely destroyed.